Hello, hello. Welcome to a fresh episode of Mocca with Moiz. My guest today is a teacher, a former journalist, someone who teaches Park Studies and Wild History, Namrah Zafar. Namrah, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you. What about you?
I am excited about this podcast.
Same.
Namrah, the first thing that comes to my mind is a lot of people our age, often when they think about teaching, they think about going into academia, teaching at a university. So, was there something that motivated you to teach at a school, or was this just by accident?
Firstly, I think there's been a great change in the narrative. I remember, like, when I was in university, a friend of mine was doing education, and I would be like, ये education कर रही है, and I would tell my desi friend ये तो teacher बनेगी, because that's what we always thought. But the thing is, there's firstly such a big scope, right? Like what you're talking about, academia, then there's research work, then you're also becoming a teacher. So firstly, we have to acknowledge the fact that there's different scopes within the educational system, especially even policy making. Secondly, I would encourage people to actually figure out if they would like to interact with people, because I'm a person who likes to interact with a lot of people. So school was a perfect place for me to interact. Of course, interaction becomes difficult, and you have to know if you really want to, if you're good with kids. But no one is bad with kids. I don't think that there's a concept such as, oh, you're bad with kids. So experiment and figure it out, and they're different scopes, but you'll only know about these scopes when you try. Teaching for me was by default. I never planned on teaching, but I think that I always taught my friends, and I had the ability to interact with kids. So it happened in a way that I fell in love with it, and I'm lucky to say actually that I enjoy going to a place that I like to work.
And what classes do you teach right now?
So at school, I'm teaching grade 6, 7, 8, but at home, while tutoring, I teach from grade 10 to up until A level, second year of A levels.
Okay, and that's Park Studies and World History.
Yeah, so I teach Pakistan Studies and World History, and at school, I teach World History and Geography just now. Started.
And you worked at Herald and Dawn earlier as well. So,
Yeah.
was there a reason of leaving journalism? Was that disillusionment, or just realizing that teaching was more rewarding?
No, actually, when I was a journalist, I thought that journalism was more fulfilling, because you really are made to believe that you're making a difference by just putting a story up. And considering that I was working at Herald, it was really good investigative journalism. So, but for me, honestly, the working hours got to a point, and we are also from a generation. So my principal once said a very funny thing, that millennials, after every 2-3 years, want a promotion. They think that they're entitled to it. But hamare jo, not even my father, I think my dada's time, the concept था कि you have to go through the grind, 9 to 5, कोई गंदी job है, अच्छी job है, but पैसे मिल रहे हैं तो वो करना है, ठीक है? But now we've also seen what you and I are doing right now. It is a profession for many people now. So for me, I just realized that the working hours were taking away from my life, and I was unhappy. And I walked away from the situation before I could get to a really slippery slope. In fact, my resignation at Herald was, I said that my mental health cannot handle it anymore. And my boss was well receiving of it, because I could not anymore. So I moved into teaching because there were better hours. But anyone who says that it's not as much work, because I used to say that, and I hear people say that, that's not true. There's a lot of work.
And one thing that's changed with our generation is also that if you're not enjoying something, it does affect your mental health. And I think it always stayed with people in the past did not realize this. So I think it's good that people now are being vocal about their mental health, and they're brave enough to step from situations which trigger their mental health. But the one thing that you said was that you thought journalism is about bringing a change, like filing a story is about bringing a change. But it's also interesting that in the last few years, we've had a clampdown against the media. So the stories that you can cover, for example, are also difficult. There were stories that you could cover a few years back that you can no longer cover. So while you were working as a journalist, were there ever any times when you thought about covering a story that you could not cover?
So I was reporting on, so if anyone who's interested in journalism, so you have different beats, right? Like are you interested in the cultural beat so I did public policy in university as one of my majors. So I really enjoyed just municipality. So I was fortunate enough, because they were cultural, I hadn't gone into the deep thing, but I was fact checking some crazy stories. But I actually, when I was heading the largest survey of Pakistan's elections at Herald, we had to have surveyors that had to go to places like Kila Saifullah and Kila Abdullah.
This was 2018, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Just Imran Khan one. So, and we were the ones who actually, so we had two forms of our survey, and SDPI, it's the Sustainable Development Program in Pakistan. They funded us and we had a really amazing experience. But I was heading the Balochistan sectors in particular. So Kila Abdullah and Kila Saifullah are places जहाँ हमें औरतों की भी चाहिए थे point of views. And वो surveyors हमें बोलते थे कि हम मर जाएंगे, we will die. And I think it was in Turbat that one of my surveyors' phone was taken by the army and thrown, and he called me from another phone and he's like, मैं नहीं करूँगा ये. So for me, I think that it was just a reality check. For me, in terms of stories, I hadn't gotten deeper into it. I was more on the back end side of doing data analysis. So I really enjoyed that part, but it was unfortunate. However, there were many stories that I fact-checked that really triggered a lot of weird buttons. Like there was a story when we did the highest number of HIV AIDS in a small town in Punjab. And it was just like the failing healthcare system, the failing educational system. There's no awareness. So, of course, there were a lot of triggers.
Okay, so for someone who teaches history, there is one critique that we often hear about, that our history books are distorted. So, for example, this larger project that we have about building Pakistan as, a citadel of Islam or as the fortress of Islam, which is why you see history books saying that Muhammad bin Qasim, for example, was the first Pakistani, and secular leaders throughout our history. So, for example, leaders like Akbar, for example, or even leaders like Sher Shah Suri or leaders like Bhagat Singh, who had an extremely important role in the independence of the subcontinent, they aren't talked about as much. Jinnah's speeches where he talked about a secular country are not talked about as much. So have you noticed a few things in our history books that you are disturbed by? Because also, when you teach O and A levels, there's not a lot of freedom you have. There's a curriculum you have, and you have to teach that. So, yeah.
Okay, so firstly, let's talk about the books part, okay? So obviously, we've been told since we were kids that history is a form of bias, right?
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. That textbooks, chahe jis dunya mein ho, you will always see a sense of it. I had a political science class back in 2014 in university. It was called Politics of South Asia, which was focusing on India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Super excited to take this class, knew I would kill it. The course pack because my professor was an Indian, the course pack that we had, which was the majority of our readings, like around 300 readings, they were selective on his preferences, his political preference. Just say, Aisha Jalal is a very famous historian, and she has written this intense thing on a two-nation theory, and where she's also criticizing the elements of it, but she's not criticizing the formation of Pakistan. She's like, it was inevitable, but the bases of the theory are questionable due to these reasons. Now,
the critique of partition or the sole spokesman?
Sorry?
Was this the sole spokesman?
Aisha? No. So I just had it as a part of an excerpt in my university package. Okay. So I haven't read Aisha Jalal's full book, but I know the excerpts of it. So, because when we used to have that, because itni sari reading, we had selective path. But what I'm saying is that after I graduated from university and when I worked at Herald, Aisha Jalal wrote an independence article. So anyway, I was saying that जब two nation theory के बारे में जब वो बात कर रही थी, तो the excerpt that is just criticizing the two nation theory has been taken in my course pack and put it, and that is influencing not just Pakistanis, Indians. There were Israelis in that class. There were a lot of different people of different cultures and societies, to a point that I know someone was saying that the concept of Pakistan then seems ridiculous. So as a sense of biasness, हर जगह होती है. We also know, हमें बचपन से बताया गया था that Nigel Kelly is in India. They've written an Indian history book, and in Pakistan, that person's written the Pakistani history book. So of course, they've pleased everyone. But yeah, so we can't change much on the narrative. It also depends on who is at the back of it. During our time, Pak Studies was made compulsory during Zia's time. So all the books that were coming were not really glorifying Zia, but showing Zia. I would say Nigel Kelly, as such, the one that I use mostly, is not biased, but as me and you we're quite old now. We've read a lot of stuff, so we will find elements. But बच्चों को इतना as such, I don't think it influences as much. It's very mild on mild terms. As you get older, you realize, oh my God, this happened in this book and now it makes sense. So I don't think I resonate with the fact, because I think history is kind of a topic that is up to everyone's pleasure. Like, it's up to everyone's interpretation.
And, it's important that I think I agree with you when you say that every history is biased and it's designed in a way that advances the state's priorities. But I think in that sense, our history books also sort of show us what the state's priorities are. So you and I were having this discussion off air as well, that there are certain history books taught in good schools which, for example, romanticize this notion of Mahmud Ghaznavi attacking Hindu temples. And then we wonder why, we have this sort of intolerance in our society and why we can't have a pluralistic society. So do you think we need more conversations about how this needs to change? Because, in the past few years, we've had so much that's been done, so many resources have been diverted towards addressing extremism. But can we really address extremism and extremist thought until we, address these issues?
Of course. And just like how you're saying about Mahmud Ghaznavi, we were also told that the Marathas in the south were the worst people, but we don't talk about the triggers that happened with them. We talk about that the Sikhs were treated us so badly, but we forget about how prior to that what they were treated, which is why Ranjit Singh had to take that approach. So yeah, of course, I completely agree with you. And that is up to us as a generation to have these conversations. So for my Pak Studies class, let's say, my boss at Herald had told me, so Malik Ghulam Muhammad, who was the second
Governor General,
the third Governor General, because first is Jinnah, then it is Khwaja Nazimuddin, because when Jinnah dies, and then third was Malik Ghulam Muhammad. So my boss said that, like, he was once telling me that how during that time the concept of democracy was hindered. That was the time that बहुत सारी infiltrations आई थी जो choose करने होती हैं, जो आप choose कर रहे हैं जिसको भी. So I think that when I teach, because I have that knowledge, I sometimes tell my students that don't fantasize this much about this person because he was this. When I'm talking even about Hitler, when we're talking about this, we also now talk about the fact that he was a creep in this way and what he did, of course. Also, there's so many new studies about even like Gandhi and his weird pleasures that have come out, and I've seen it in my A-level students. They're super aware and really vocal, and especially the ones who are in MUN and all of that, they really know. So they kind of have an idea. So, from our generation to theirs, and I can't believe I'm saying this because I don't want to accept that I'm that old, there has been also a great form of exposure for these kids to resonate with things that they think is right. So if you think, अब इतने लोग नहीं होंगे बच्चे ये महमूद गजनवी को करेंगे because of these internet facilities. But again, we're talking about a very small privileged class who have access to the internet, who have access to being taught in English and to do some sort of critical thinking by themselves.
And for me, as a lawyer, it's important that you talk about Ghulam Muhammad, because apparently when the first martial law was imposed in Pakistan back in 1958, Ghulam Muhammad would often send, people from the government to visit the Chief Justice at that time. And there was a lot of collusion between the judiciary and the government at that time, which is why the judiciary sided not with democracy, but with dictatorship. And the Chief Justice at that time, Muhammad Munir, later wrote a book saying that legitimizing the first martial law in Pakistan was perhaps one of my biggest mistakes. And had I not done that, Pakistan's trajectory might have been very different. So,
in fact, by the way, Malik Ghulam Muhammad was also a bureaucrat. So he infiltrated the whole democratic system by just being a bureaucrat then he gave the way to civil rights kind of situation. I wanted to talk to you about something that we were discussing prior to that, and what you're saying about the religious aspect. Malik Ghulam Muhammad, we were talking about history. I feel that from the start, we had given the precedent to जब हमारी objective resolution बनी थी, which was the first draft, which was back in 1950. 49 was the first draft, and then Liaquat Ali Khan said, let's lay it off for a bit. Why did he say that let's lay it off for a bit? Was because the Islamic ulamas were very unhappy that it wasn't Islamic enough. And so Nigel Kelly में 3-4 lines हैं on the fact that the Islamic ulamas were unhappy because they had to remind the authorities that they migrated because of Islam, like the concept of Islam. So they need to be taken care of. और एक line है नीचे उसके after that paragraph on the fact कि East Pakistanis were also unhappy because of lack of representation. So if Liaquat Ali Khan had set the precedent from that, continued what Jinnah was saying, ye sari cheezon ki naubat nahi aati kind of situation. The thing is, me and you can have these conversations and hope for the best, but we've really allowed that culture to be infiltrated not for more than 60 years, 70 years.
And I think like no book mentions, right? I think Nigel Kelly does not mention this, that all non-Muslim members of the House at that time, the Assembly at that time, had also dissented. They did not agree with the objective resolution, and they said that this was a betrayal of Jinnah's principles. And it's also important that all these ulemas, most of them were actually opposed to the idea of partition. Maududi, for example, said that Pakistan would not be an Islamic country. It would be a secular state, so we should not opt for Pakistan. But when Pakistan came, you gave them a position on the table. And I guess that became much worse during Zia's era, where you had, you had the Council of Islamic Ideology, which we will talk about later as well. And you see them now, bulldoze any progressive reforms that the government tries to bring.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, actually. I wanted to ask you about this later, but let's just talk about this right now. You probably know about the domestic violence bill that was brought in the assembly a few days back.
Yeah.
And after backlash from certain elements, certain religious elements, certain right-wing journalists, the government decided to take that bill or refer that bill to the Islamic Ideology Council. Now, the Council of Islamic Ideology is composed only of men, and the council has a history of extremely problematic decisions. A few years back, the council, for example, said that light beating of women is allowed. It's permissible.
Yeah, I remember that.
So, as a woman yourself, and as somebody who understands politics, who understands how these issues work, what message does the government give? Does the government give you a message that when there's a dispute between you and your oppressors, the government would rather side with your oppressors than you?
Yeah, definitely. And do you not remember that highway case after that also? Like, women have been let down at so many... You know what? Imran Khan could have come and just said one thing. We were just talking about it off air, that he's talking about Dilip Kumar's Twitter. He's talking about people's, even he's saying pray for Palestine. And of course, jo Palestine mein ho raha hai, like it's the worst thing, and we've been hearing about it for years. But we also been told कि पहले अपने आप में देखो and then बाहर जाके देखो. Seek first for that. I'm not saying ignore what's happening to Palestine. It was the best thing that they at least sent a messenger from here to go talk. But what I'm saying is that there has been no acknowledgement about it. Also, the trigger words which he said about the clothes.
Yeah.
Now is the time. And if you see from that, and I don't support any political party, but if you've seen PPP have a much more progressive stance, because they have a lot more women who are part of the political sphere of PPP. Like Shahid Rahman always condones it, okay? And I don't agree with Shahid Rahman. PPP wasn't the best of its government. In fact, if we talk about education, when we'll go back to it, PTI's budget has been the greatest. But the thing is, PTI has failed to have that social humanitarian aspect. Even हम PMLN की बात करें तो जब फैजाबाद sit-ins हुए थे, I vaguely remember that they were way better dealt with than this.
Yeah. But there was no surrender like there is now.
Yeah.
But it's also important, and I think it's very convenient as well, that when the government says that if a woman is raped, it's because of her clothes. It's also convenient because then you're saying that if a woman is raped, the next time don't come and ask us why she's raped, because we've told her that the responsibility to avoid that rape is on her shoulders. So like, you can't blame us.
Doesn't that affect your laws then?
I mean, it does, but then one can argue that even the laws we have, for example, are quite problematic. So we had certain amendments that came in 2006 as well. It's interesting to remember that Imran Khan actually voted against those amendments. And even those amendments were diluted to a certain extent. And our rape laws were amended during Zia's regime as well. I'm not an expert on criminal law.
Okay.
But I mean, for example, DNA is still not allowed in a number of cases. And I think there have been a few progressive judgments these days, one by Justice Aisha Malik of the Lahore High Court, one by Justice Mansoor Ali Shah at the Supreme Court level. But I remember, so I was at the Supreme Court when the Mukhtara Mai case was heard. And one of the three judges on the bench, for example, said that, well, but why won't you report this case immediately? Why did she come 3 days late? And they said that, when you're raped, for a moment, for a few days at least, there's a degree of shock. And there's
denial. There is
denial.
A lot of what if you don't want to accept? We have to accept that every woman, majority of women in Pakistan have had various encounters that have made them feel uncomfortable. ठीक है? I'm not saying the extreme of rape, and there are lots of cases which have also been unreported, but we've all been. I have a group of girls, and if you make us sit and we talk about it, I'm sure a lot of us have instances. Since I've had encountered 4, 6. So, but. And I'm not also saying that it's just gender sideline. I also know that men have also been. But the thing is, unfortunately, women are a really regressive group in society, no matter where you go.
And the court said that, well, look, yeah, we'd agree that it's difficult to come and report this case had you been a virgin, but since you were not, like, it shouldn't have shocked you. So, and I think that, again, goes on to what we were discussing earlier, that when you have, like, 3 men determine whether or not, like, what constitutes rape, how soon should you report rape, that's also why your laws are as regressive. We talked about Churels, and we know that you had a cameo in Churels as well. There was a line from Churels that somebody had tweeted yesterday that you talk about the law, but the law is also drafted by men. So I think this is a larger critique of how our laws also exist and how they also, oppress women.
Yeah. And the influence of religion is to a great extent. For us, I'm hopeful, but if we are in a realistic world, I don't know when there's going to be a leader who's going to be like, no, I'm not going to listen to them, because their hold is very strong. मतलब एक bill नहीं pass हो रहा है because वो लोग मना कर रहे हैं. तो I mean, जब एक a Maulvi rapes that child and you have proof also. इस time पे like you're asking a woman, oh, we don't know this. एक बच्चा ने पूरा proof लिया है, उसको भी you're delaying it. That's ridiculous.
And it's funny how this Islam Khatre Mein Hai, lobby does not come when, a Maulvi, for example, rapes a kid in a mosque.
Yeah.
That's not against Islam apparently, but when there's a law that's tabled which says that don't abuse women, don't torture them, their Islam and their religion and their family system is suddenly under threat. The one thing that's also extremely important is that when you talk about cases like harassment, and because you've been a part of the media as well, a TV channel, for example, a few days back hosted an award show. And the host of that award show is somebody who's been accused of harassment by a number of women in the past. And now there are 2 sides. One side says that, well, because it's so difficult to prove harassment and because the laws are skewed against women, a person who hasn't been proven innocent until now should not be given a platform like that. Yeah. And then there's one side that says, due process, because he hasn't been proven guilty, there's no harm in, giving him that platform. Yeah. So where do you stand on that divide?
I'm honestly so confused about this whole scenario, because also the whole Misha, Safi and Alizafra case has been going on for so long. And the thing is, the defense, which I 100% believe Misha, and I also believe that if a woman is coming out with such a big claim, draining so much money, so much like people are trolling her left, right, center, if she's doing that, there has to be truth in it, because she doesn't want someone else to be to fall his prey next time. So of course there is something, but the thing is that what you're saying, that the media has eventually, you know how it is, like we say in Karachi, some big thing happens, and I think 2-3 दिन बाद there'll be something else to talk about. It's literally like that. And even though this case has been so strong, and I'm so glad that people are still talking about it, it's just something that's also gone on the back burner for them to celebrate it. I don't think, absolutely not, should he be put as a host, because he is under cases right now. So whatever happens till they were declared, like if he is not, has he been proven guilty?
No, not yet.
Not yet, but there's still cases going on, right? जब तक वो cases हैं, for the integrity of law and justice, you should keep both of them out. Like, I'm not saying that to get the other one, but keep them out as a form of it. When the stance comes, then you celebrate the person who's right and who's wrong. But up until then, no, you should not have them.
And this also, calls into question media's commitment towards these issues. So, for example, the channel in question had a show about child abuse a few years back, for example.
Okay.
But when you, for example, also invite someone who's been accused of harassment to your award show and ask him to host that show, one would have to question if all those, pro-women's shows that you have, were they only a way for you to earn money, or were you actually doing that as, in pursuance of your commitment towards human rights and women's rights in particular?
But also talking about pro-women, what are the shows? My colleague at Herald did a whole story on the morning shows, and all the women's shows were quite derogatory of the whole stance of women. Also, if you go on Instagram, if you go on that Misha Shafi recently posted that thing off her Twitter, that don't call me to the thing. I was reading the comment section on one of the news Instagram handles, And then, like, majority of people, even women, like, women don't have each other's back. What
Yeah.
society are we talking about? We're talking about the most regressive society. I don't know how, if you feel that way, but after leaving journalism, I went through a hell of a time in terms of my mental health. Then I stopped reading the newspaper. Everything I know now is a clickbait, Twitter stuff. I recently, when you told me recently, and I have more time to work, less time from work and more time to chill, I've started reading again Dawn. And recently, only after Moiz contacted me, I read a lot on Pervez Hoodboy and stuff. And I just realized that I am living as a citizen of life where I'm unhappy with this thing, but I'm happy with what is happening around in me. So, and unfortunately, I've become a little ignorant, which is not someone who I wanted to be or I thought I would be, but I feel like for my sanity, so that I don't get heart palpitations on little things, I've had to just do it because this state has constantly disappointed us. Then we will eventually talk about how it's failed us in education, it's failed us in healthcare. So I don't know, especially for women, it's been a really bad time here.
And I guess you talked about, how regressive our morning shows are. And we've covered this in some of our earlier episodes as well. I mean, most dramas, so for example, you've had dramas in the past which, for example, talk about how if a woman accuses somebody of harassment, that woman is lying.
But thappar kitna normal hai?
Yeah.
Like, how normal is thappars in every TV show I have seen here?
And a woman is only as good, a woman is only a good woman if she sacrifices her entire life for her family. Like if she is extremely dutiful towards her husband, and yeah, so I agree with that. The one other thing that's extremely important, you talked about the state failing us when it comes to education. And we often talk about children who are out of schools, but even the children who are going to school, it's important to talk about the kind of education that we're giving them. And you recently had the single national curriculum, and you talked about Pervez Hoodboy as well. Have you had a chance to look at the critiques of the single national curriculum? Because I was reading that a few days back, there were certain clerics who were also apparently a part of that single national curriculum committee in Punjab. And they said that, for example, in math books, you can't have references to interest.
And the word markup.
The markup, yeah.
What is the concept of having, what is markup? Is it a perverted word or something?
No, apparently because it's interest and it's haram, so yeah.
Oh, I literally, when I was reading, I was thinking for so long, what is this word markup?
Yeah. No, and they've apparently opposed the inclusion of diagrams in biology textbooks. So now you probably have doctors who haven't really seen a human body.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah. So what do you feel about the single national curriculum?
Okay, so firstly, the state failing us in terms of education goes back to all the years. They've had optimistic policies but poor execution. Let's talk about 1970. They had this concept of single curriculum.
And nationalizing schools as well, yeah.
Yeah, for a while, right? Then East Pakistan got separated. Bhutto had one of his policies was to increase it. And so he nationalized a lot of schools. Textbooks were given to people and all of that. But again, it didn't produce the quality because although he did have a lot of teaching training programs. So I was reading a lot of policies and I completely agree with this quote which says that education is not the common interest of the common man in Pakistan, which means that majority of people don't think education is important because it's never been made to be important. As a privileged, very, very privileged, lucky class can say, oh, we've been very educated and we can sit here and comment on it. But the thing is, if you go to, apart from the main cities, if you go anywhere, it's absolutely crap. Jab last year COVID hua tha, so many students from Balochistan, the province that is impoverished, right? Like treated so badly in every way. Udhar jo log jo BNU mein the, which is Balochistan National University or the Quetta, but they were a lot from Gaon. They had to go back to the Gaon because lockdown ho gaya tha. But they had online classes, but there was no internet in that. So whose work is this? And since 1990, our education has dropped. And the education sector is mostly handled by NGOs in all these areas. So I'm just asking is where is that investment going? So that's the first part that we have to question, that the state has not failed now. The state's been failing us with the education system since a long time.
And I think there's no focus on how COVID, for example, has accentuated all these differences. So, for example, if you and I were going to the same school earlier, in many ways, you and I were getting the same experience. But now that you're in a city like Karachi, and if I'm in the northern areas, for example, if I'm in Hunza and I don't have access to the internet, so those differences between you and I have been aggravated even further.
Yeah.
And I think there's no focus on, remedying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, then now let's talk about the single national curriculum that he just commented on a bunch of things. First, let's talk about the positives of it, because we both have read the whole statement that came out. So there's a lot on critical thinking. There's a lot on analytical skills. So it's also written that English will be taught as not as a second language, but as not as a subject, but as a language. So okay, you're adapting to the changes. So you're making it a little less ratta, from what I'm understanding, your previous matriculation system, because that's greatly flawed. So, usme to I think thoda we have to look at the positives, because also we have to acknowledge the fact that PTI has had a 28 billion rupees budget this year on education, which is 500 times more than PMLN has. So thankfully they are making it into a common interest. So but now let's look at the things. There are very few states in the world that actually include religion in their books. My problem is not with having Islamiyat. Islamiyat is okay because we study here. ठीक है. ये बहुत सालों से ये concept चल रहा है. Me and you cannot sit here.
And there's a much larger debate about whether or not we should have a separate religion and a separate state, which is perhaps beyond the scope of.
Yeah, this doesn't even come there. That's like a whole conversation we should have one-on-one. ठीक है. So अब education की बात करते हैं तो few countries like Indonesia I read, but हमारी खुद की constitution में article 22 says that you have an option of studying religious studies, and if let's say there's not a single mention of the minorities in this single curriculum. There's only focus on that. So that's my problem, that again you're forgetting you only have to work for that 2% of that population, the minorities population, but you're not even giving them that much respect to have one line, and non-Muslims can during those lessons can study what they want. There's no mention of that. Then what you're talking about biology, if you don't see the part of the body, like as teachers, we want our students by grade 8 to have a direction of what you want to do. Beta lawyer banna hai, to like start working on it. There are internship opportunities, start hearing podcasts and all. How can I tell a student who's not looking at anything, do you want to be a doctor? Do you even know these basics? And are we not, as doctors, supposed to, if we are doctors, supposed to normalize every part of our body? Because that's a part of a theory. In fact, as all of us human beings, these are the parts, like we all have the same parts of bodies, which we have to normalize. Like if I say a word, like, these are things that like we're just going backwards basically. I was thinking of words to say about my body, but then I just realized that I could get into trouble, right? Like that's the fear I have in this society now.
Okay. And I think it's worse for those. So for example, people in Karachi or people who go to schools that you and I have gone to may not have this curriculum, but there's people who actually go to government schools, for example, may be affected more by this. Which also brings me to my next question, that I saw a few videos on your blog, on your teaching blog, where you spoke about cultural sensitivity. And we were talking about an award show, and there has been a lot of critique about the clothes that certain women wore to that award show.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, for example, to teach students during their early years at school that what a woman wears, for example, is none of your business.
Yeah.
Your honor is not attached to what a woman does.
Yeah.
It's not attached to your mother or your sister or your wife's conduct. And I think people who go to, for lack of a better word, elite schools still have a sense of that. Some may not, but like a lot of people are still exposed to those values. But I don't think there's much in the single national curriculum, for example, that does or that even discusses cultural sensitivity.
No.
Or that talks about classes, character building classes, for example.
No, not at all. But ek line thi na, that was saying analytical and critical thinking.
Yeah.
Now you're not even explaining to them what the critical thinking
Yeah.
is. I was fortunate enough to, at my school, have a bunch of trainings on critical thinking and independent learning. That's when a child can think beyond their
I mean,
textbook.
when you can't even have words like Mocca, what critical thinking do you expect? Yeah.
So it's like press censorship, like you're restraining people from thinking about this time. You know, what you were talking about, this cultural sensitivity and stuff. In fact, it could have a really adverse thing. Okay, firstly, let's talk about the fact that the purpose of the single curricula is to have, all around, is to have equality. Okay? I read an article a couple of years ago, and I actually was searching before, I think, and I couldn't find it. But I distinctly remember that in the 70s and 80s, they said that a private school and a public school did not have much difference in terms of quality. My boss at Herald studied from a local Punjab University at that time, उस वक्त जब government की होती थी, और बहुत सारे लोग, like my dad studied from DG Science, it's a Sindh government college. He ended up being a stockbroker. अब ज़्यादा हो गए थे. तो when you're talking about equality, are you only promising a curriculum? What about the infrastructure? What about the teachers? Also, you're integrating private schools, madrasas, but एक हुआ है कि the madrasa teachers will not come to private schools. We're not forcing
And there's
you.
a regulation of madrasas as well.
Yeah.
In that sense, yeah. Because, for example, there have been a lot of grants by the PTI government to a madrasa in Peshawar, which is responsible for creating extremists. And I mean, I know that there was a lot of funding, but there's no evidence to suggest that there was also some regulation of that madrasa. So, yeah.
You know, it's so sad because we would have thought by 2021, like by having Imran Khan do whatever he said on his notion of Naya Pakistan, could have actually, we definitely needed to level up our education system, but he's just making it regressive, right? In terms of the concept. But right now, we also have to see it play for it to see. But now we're also saying that it's 2021, 2022. Is he going for 2018, 2019, next year is his elections, right?
23 actually.
23.
So, yeah. A year and a half now, yeah.
So how can we see the impact and the effect जब वो एक साल की report आएगी कि बहुत सारे बच्चे, so if he wanted to do this experiment also of it, they've been talking since last year, okay?
Yeah.
This should have been his first policy to try out till he comes to see, we can see it in effect so that we can vote for him next year.
Yeah.
I'm, as a citizen who does love the country, to vote for it for the sake of it, at this point don't know who to vote for because of these things, because he could have just come and leveled it up. You know, O-levels is only being taught in Pakistan and Bangladesh. It's been out everywhere else. At my school, we do Edexcel because it's an international school. But जो मेरी textbook थी, वो मेरी बहन की भी textbook है. So it's been obsolete. And Shafqat Mahmood also with his notion that A-levels, वो exams ho ya na ho, that whole state of uncertainty. It's just been really chaotic, and we haven't gotten much from the government, no support.
Okay. And the last question that's extremely important is, because you teach history, you're somebody who's interested in history, political science, are there any books that moved you or that really, broadened or shaped your worldview?
You know, when you sent me that question to prepare, I was thinking, because I could have lied to all of you and looked some up. But the thing is that the only times since I was a kid, I really loved reading, but biographies and all. But I've had great history teachers at school. So I was lucky enough to go to Bayview Academy and Lyceum in Pakistan.
Did DFS teach you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. He didn't teach
No,
you,
DFS, no.
Okay.
Dr. Satta.
Okay, no. Okay,
DFS is in
Nixa. Yeah. I was there, yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, so Dr. Satta was my teacher in Lyceum, and in my history at Bayview, it was Miss Aisha and Miss Musarat. They were really great teachers. Then when I went to university, all the stuff that I read was just in my course packs, it was so good and having great influence that I don't have a book in particular that would move you. I think there were people who really got me into knowing about history. I remember a teacher telling me that she loved Bismarck, and then I was like, oh my God, when I read his policies, I started liking him as well. So, it was a lot more conversational than a reading.
And that really shows the importance that teachers can play in your life and in shaping your worldview.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking out the time, Namrah. This was really good. And until next time, keep watching.